So we might as well get right to it, I guess. I'm curious about the overlap, or the lack of overlap, I suppose, in the principles that we've been promoting. I've been thinking, for example, some of the success of the convention so far and of our organization has been, well, the positive vision element of what we're promoting. And I guess that's where I'd like to go with you. Yesterday, we had a very interesting panel on energy, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot, energy and the environment. Scott Tinker, in particular, has outlined a vision of the future, and it's not a net zero vision, I can tell you that. It's a vision where we cooperate to do everything we possibly can to drive energy prices down as low as they can possibly be, using everything at our disposal, right? Nuclear, coal, gas, oil, solar, wind, whatever can compete, because the most effective way of enriching the absolutely poor and likely of serving long-term environmental needs is to make people wealthy, so they can afford to care about the future, especially in the developing world. And so I'm kind of wondering, you have an opportunity now, because the right is split in the UK, to really hash things out on the conservative side. And this sort of thing happened a bit in Canada, and that means that it's possible now for conservatives to push the envelope. And I'm really curious about your view on, it isn't exactly even on net zero, which I think is an appalling policy, to get that right out on the table. But more than that, it's like, how appalling is it?
Good morning, everybody.
Yeah.
Old-fashioned upbringing, couldn't help it. First things first, the right is not split in this country. The Conservative Party is not on the right in any measurable way. 14 years that brought us the highest tax burdens since 1947, 14 years that saw mass immigration, legal mass immigration on a scale hitherto never even dreamt of, 14 years that saw illegal immigration, small boats crossing the channel, and the government completely incapable of dealing with it because they couldn't face up to what membership of the European Convention on Human Rights was all about. And 14 years that saw net zero enshrined into law by a Conservative government and Boris Johnson, Theresa May, as evangelical about net zero as the current Ed Miliband. We take the view that if we're going to be using gas, if we're going to be using oil in this country till 2050, and even the most zealous net zero types accept we'll be using these commodities for years to come, our view is if we're going to be using them, we may as well produce them ourselves in our own country and genuinely become energy independent. And our platform is to reindustrialize Britain. We've closed down our steel industry. You know, we think closing down a steel industry is good because it means our national CO2 output is down, and all that happens is the plant closes in Redcar, the plant closes in South Wales, it reopens in India under lower environmental standards, and then the steel is shipped back to us. So let's produce all the stuff we need in this country. Let's become not just energy independent, we could actually become an energy exporter. Right now, every day we import 10 to 15% of our electricity, and our industrial energy prices are between 4 and 6 times higher than America. Not only that, but everybody out there, and of course this hurts the poor more than anybody, we've had 20% subsidies on domestic electricity bills going on now for the best part of 2 decades. And it's a truth that no one dares tell. So look, net zero is a complete and utter disaster. If you want to have energy production that is very, very low in carbon output, there is only one way ahead. That is small, modular, nuclear reactors, dozens of them all over the country. It's the only way forward.
Okay. Well,
it's the only way forward. And you know, if you look at the way the Far East produces nuclear energy, we can do it a damn sight cheaper than we've ever done it before.
Okay, okay. Well, that warms a Canadian's heart. And it's good to get warm in a convention center that's this chilly because of the net zero restrictions. But let me push it a little bit, you know, because we have the opportunity to do that, and I think that it's time. You know, you talked about at least until 2050. And one of the things I've been discussing with my fellow Canadians, let's say, is the fact that, I mean, maybe it's time to stop our obsession with carbon altogether. And so I'm going to say something relatively radical. And well, let's just play this out and see how it goes. So, you know, I've reviewed a lot of scientific papers. Now, they're not climate papers, but I'm a reasonable hand at separating the wheat from the chaff on the scientific front. And when I look at the carbon data, there is one fact that leaps out to me in my experience with scientific data is that there's usually one or two major facts and a bunch of trivial sub-facts that more or less you can ignore. As far as I can tell, the most stunning effect of carbon, atmospheric carbon, that has been recorded scientifically is the effect of carbon on plant growth. Right, and we know this. Look, in the last 25 years, thereabouts, 20% of the Earth's surface is greened. 20% is a lot. It's a lot. It's an area equivalent to twice the size of the continental US, so that gives you a quick picture of scale. And it's also primarily greened in semi-arid areas, because when you give plants more carbon dioxide, their stomata close, and so they can live where it's drier. And so the deserts are shrinking, not growing, which is exactly the opposite of what we were told was going to happen. And crop yields are up, something approximating 10 to 13%. So that's not bad, that's good. And so I'm afraid that even throwing the dog a bone, let's say, and saying, well, we're certainly not going to hit our 2030 targets because they were proposed by buffoons and liars. We're not going to hit our 2050 targets either. I'm dead serious. This is not good. And so I'm curious about how far this needs to be taken. I have because I also think, conceivably, that the environmentalist climate scam was really an offshoot of the Club of Rome Malthusian stupidity that is predicated on the presumption that resources are finite and that there's far too many people on the planet, and there's a terrible anti-human motivation lurking underneath all of that that's pessimistic and brutal and genocidal in its fundamental ethos. And I think it's kind of time for people who would like energy to be inexpensive and reliable and there for the poor to just end it. It's like no more carbon apocalypse mongering and terrorizing. And so I guess I'm wondering what you think about that.
Well, the one thing that drives me absolutely potty is when I hear that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. That's what they tell us. That clearly is absolutely nuts. Now, there are times in our past when CO2 in the atmosphere has been much, much higher than it is today, and that's before people drove 4x4 Chelsea tractors. And I remember having this debate about 20 years ago. There was a man called Sir Patrick Moore.
Yes.
Very famous scientist, The Sky at Night, great character, very respected man. And I said to him about 20 years ago, I said, Patrick, what do you think about man's impact on the environment through CO2? He said, well, it's impossible to think man doesn't have some sort of impact. He said, but when it comes to carbon dioxide levels and when it comes to warming and cooling, he said, let me assure you that sunspot activity and underwater volcanic activity will always have a bigger impact on the environment than man himself ever can, and I very much stuck to that view. So I'm not a scientist. I can't tell you whether CO2 is leading to warming or not, but there are so many other massive factors. And Jordan, I was told that of all the CO2 that's produced every year in the world, only 3 to 5% of it is produced by mankind. So we do, as you rightly say, need to get this debate into a sense of perspective. And I sometimes think that the carbon dioxide hysteria has actually blinded us to other environmental disasters that are going on, such as the rape of our oceans and many other things. I'm an environmentalist in the old school sense and definition of that term. A bit more common sense, that's what we need.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to harass you about one other issue too. I think we'll focus on 2 out of our 5 platforms. So the principle that we've founded ourselves on that actually produced the most internal dissent in our organization was our family policy. Now, I spent a fair bit of time speaking with authorities in Hungary about their family policy. Hungary spends a substantial amount of their GDP on family policy. It's 7%. They were concerned about a variety of issues. High rate of abortion, high rate of divorce, low rate of female participation in the workforce, which is kind of a strange addition to that group, but that was still a concern, and extremely low birth rate. And so they made it a priority to address those, and they've had some success reducing abortion, which is still legal in Hungary, substantively, reducing the divorce rate, flattening the decline in the birth rate. They haven't managed to pop it up again. Only Israel has managed that, by the way, and it's not exactly obvious why. And we argued this out amongst the ARC members, and our consensus by the end was that the core of civilization as such, and the Western civilization that we're attempting to reinvigorate, let's say, is, first of all, a circle of tolerance, okay? So we'll make that the a priori axiom, but then a commitment to long-term, stable, married, monogamous, heterosexual, child-centered marriages. And so now that's a fairly restrictive ideal. You know, ideals are restrictive. And, you know, we're all cognizant of the fact that within our own families, for example, 40% of our siblings, let's say, are likely to be divorced, that there's no shortage of single mothers, that homosexuality and homosexual couples exist, and that there's going to be deviations from the norm. But I'm curious, again, like in your view, you could make the case that that stable, committed monogamy, heterosexual, child-centered monogamy, is the kind of long-term commitment to community, to sacrifice, and to future that's the fundamental unit of civilized society. And so I'm curious, Mike, what do you think about that?
Well, I may not necessarily be the best advocate for monogamous heterosexuality or stable marriage, having been divorced twice. But do I think family matters? Jordan, on the 3rd of June last year, as I was coming into London by car to go back into politics, having left it a few years before, my ambition was to get the United Kingdom to be a self-governing, independent nation. And for many, many years, I was pretty much on my own fighting that battle. The day we left the European Union, I thought, right, I've done my job. And that day on the 3rd of June, when I was coming back, thinking, well, this really rather comfortable, lovely life I've got is about to disappear, I thought, why am I doing it? And I came up with 3 words: family, community, and country. They're the things that matter to me above absolutely everything. And I have tried, in difficult circumstances, I've tried to make sure with both ex-wives that our children have had as stable an upbringing, given the circumstances, as they can possibly have. I think part of this, and this is important, about who we are as a country and who the West is, we've kind of forgotten that what underpins everything is our Judeo-Christian culture. And that's where we need to start. That's where we need to start. And if we recognize that, and if we value that, then I think everything comes from that. So yes, of course, family matters enormously. Of course, we need higher birth rates. But we're not going to get higher birth rates in this country until we can get some sense of optimism. And we need a complete 180 shift in attitudes. We've got to start telling young kids that hard work is good, that success is good, that there are no shortcuts in life, that making money is good. And what I see is we sort of disincentivize young people, and to think that another million young people since the start of the pandemic are on disability benefits because they're suffering from depression and the doctors sign them off. We need some very, very big cultural changes. We've got to get that spirit, that sense of optimism back in the country. We had it in the late 1980s. We actually had it through much of the 1990s. That's what we have to recapture. And frankly, being led as we are by, I mean, God, doesn't Rachel Reeves just make you want to reach for the cry tissues? I mean, it's all so miserable. It's all so declinist. Frankly, the Conservatives have been no better. We need a change of attitude in Britain. And if we get that right, people will have more kids.
Yeah. All right. Well, that was short and sweet, and there's obviously many other issues that we could discuss, and no doubt will, but I would like to thank you very much for coming and talking to us today, and to letting me harass you about these issues.
It's
very good to talk to you, sir.
Thank you, George.
Yeah, good luck. Thank you, everybody.